So today we're going to talk about is media literacy being practiced to its full capacity, and I have the pleasure of interacting with Belinha De Abreu to help us answer this question. Um, so Belinha and all of us know one another very well at the International Council for Media Literacy, where she's president. She's a professor at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. She has a PhD in curriculum and instruction with a media literacy focus from the University of Connecticut. She's an award-winning researcher and the author of 13 books, so she's pretty prolific when it comes to media literacy and related pedagogical subjects. I know that her Routledge book, Media Literacy, Equity, and Justice, is just out of the oven and on stands right now and in libraries. She's served as an international expert to the Forum on Media and Information Literacy for UNESCO's Communication and Information section. And as I said, she's the president of IC4ML, which was earlier known as National Co-Media Council. Basically, it's the first media literacy organization in the United States. Belinha, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, jumping right in, do you think media literacy is being practiced to its full capacity, Belinha?
No, not at all. And in fact, one of the things that I would say is concerning is that the way it is being discussed and looked upon is very limited and has been that way probably since 2016 after the United States presidential election, when all of a sudden the focus became on mis and disinformation. And that has literally been the thing that propelled media literacy forward in many ways, because it allowed for the first time for people to understand what media literacy is and what the work was that I've been doing all this time. But it's also limited its scope because it is the only thing that people want to talk about now. We don't talk about critical thinking. We don't talk about critical evaluation. We tend to, there's a lot about checkologies and check systems, which certainly serve a purpose, but isn't to the critical depth in which I think media literacy education should be at. And so that's partly why my concern with where media literacy is going has kind of delved a little bit further. It's one of the reasons why, you know, when I do my conferences, I'm pushing at people for more than just the basics of media literacy, and more than just this idea of where mis and disinformation is at, because there is so much more. And the other part of it that I think it's being limited to is social media as well, where, you know, if we're not talking about mis and disinformation, then we're talking about digital citizenship, and the spectrum of that doesn't allow for, once again, this idea of, okay, well, that's an access piece, that's a, you know, who are people in these spaces, but what else is going on? You know, what else is happening in these spaces? Who's putting that information forward? Who is behind the messaging? You know, who's not in the messaging, and perhaps how is it politically motivated or not, and so forth. So there's a lot of issues surrounding that.
I had two questions, but the first one is going to be, then media literacy, because of this new post-2016 kind of a focus or a sharp focus, which has, I think, been a very convenient focus, because on the one hand, it becomes very tactical to address, say, fake news or misinformation, disinformation, etc., and not strategic enough. Is that something that bothers you in the sense that, okay, what are we going to do with fake news? I mean, we can correct it,
Right,
and then we can teach folks how to decode some things, and then we're kind of done. Does that bother you?
So yeah, and I think that's actually where the problem is at, is this assumption that we will teach people and we've done our job and we've washed our hands of it. And the reality is that there is more to people So what led someone to the mis and disinformation in the first place is a part of the issue, right? The background of the person, what it is that in their social stratosphere has placed them in these places where they're willing to accept information. And a lot of what we see is such at a minimal level, it doesn't really delve into that piece. And also the other part is that this assumption that people want to be decoded, and want to have the deconstruction happening. And that's not to say that they won't accept it to a certain degree, but I think when you are at a political point, or if your beliefs are in a particular area, that it's very hard for you to get to another perspective unless you are able to delve more deeply. And that's where I feel the sort of this
Right.
very baseline look at information hasn't helped us.
Right. So you used a very important word, I think, which is deconstruction. And deconstruction really is a methodology, as everybody, including Derrida, saw it. I think then we are talking about the original question that I was asking you, which is it's too tactical, it's too much on the surface. It's not evolved as an actual methodology. I mean, we have been unable to evolve a methodology, probably a toolkit, which is actually a method, but really not a methodology, is what I'm hearing you say. Yeah, go ahead, Belinha, and then I'll ask you.
Well, no, but I think what the problem is that, there are toolkits, but that doesn't mean it's pedagogically sound.
That's right.
And I think that's where the issue comes in. And it's a great selling point because it's very understandable. For the average person to say, hey, maybe if you check the URL and you check the ending of the URL, and, if you looked at these things on web pages, or maybe if you thought about who the source was, that would make a difference. But by the same token, you have to sort of lead someone in that direction to want to go further on, because so what? You could end up on a web page that actually has all the right things and is still misinforming somebody. So in order to get to more depth, it's really about, in some ways what we call lateral reading, but beyond that, it's also the idea that there's got to be many more pieces of information in place. And we don't, with check systems, do that very well, because it's so basic and it's like, okay, well, we did all these pieces, we've done our part. It's not enough. It's let's take it to a very basic level. You want to take a flight someplace, okay? You pick an airline that you think is a great airline. Okay, you get a price, but the price doesn't fit what you want to pay. So you go search for another airline. How do you know that that airline is the better airline? How do you know that the services that you're going to get? Did you think about the 13-hour, delay that you might have? And what's the whole reason? So those are more, the further you go into thinking about just this very basic idea puts you in another area. And I think that's what gets lost in this fact-checking piece. It never gets you there.
Belinha, I want to shift focus then to, not shift focus, but relatedly, is the new form of media literacy, which is hyper-focused into misinformation and disinformation, making folks trust differently, by which I mean that is there an attempt by media literacy in pedagogical as well as non-pedagogical forms of, say, training and toolkits and so forth, to reclaim institutional trust, by which they're saying, okay, so while there may be a small percentage of disinformation on the mainstream media, they're the ones to go to. Do not go to social media. So by doing so, are they letting the mainstream media off the hook? And also building a different kind of trust?
So I think it's a very complex question that you're asking, because I think the question of trust is the overarching problem. And the reality is that with the media as it stands, trust is going to be very hard to build. It's not the media of 20 years ago. And I'm not sure, I don't want to say that everybody trusted everything they watched on television either, but
Right.
We are in a place where media has become about opinion makers and not about news. And the reason why people have distrust is because they can't differentiate between fact and an opinion. And that has lent itself to many more issues. I find it fascinating. This past week, I was told about the program on CNN that was with Bride Stelzer was called Reliable Sources, Reliable Sources, excuse me. Right. And it's off the air now after 30 years. And I have a very vivid memory of a conversation that was played with him and Ted Koppel, where Ted Koppel really questioned whether or not, him having this program really was in and of itself a reliable source. Because when you start to question the questioners, are you placing yourself in a place where you're the one who really needs to be looked at? And I found that a fascinating sort of response, because that's a very critical approach to looking at yourself. Yes. Okay, that's first. But two, it requires that you acknowledge that this role is perpetuating some of the problem. Right. And that's the part that I think sort of was getting missed along the way. And I find that that's kind of true of some of the stuff that we're seeing happening now. We've made it so that at least now people understand that this is a part of media literacy. The problem is that everyone thinks this is the whole of media literacy. And that's not true, because it negates the fact that there were film studies and all this other work that was being done prior to that, radio, television, all the way through. There was a lot more going on: advertising, politics, propaganda, all the language and words that we know already existed before this, but somehow it's sort of still pushed in the back. Like, we'll get to that at some point, but we're not getting to, especially from a number of very well-known organizations, is all about mis and disinformation.
As you said, there's the role of politics in all this, and there's that political anxiety, it seems, among media literacy proponents to solve the problem through media literacy. But I think that's pretty much all the time. Yes, Belinha, we'll have closing remarks from you, and then
I know this very quickly. I just, we don't have enough time for this, but that last piece where you said where it solves the problem, that's where I think the actual problem exists. It's a piece of solving the problem, but it's not the sole solution. And when I hear people say things like inoculation, which I heard a lot this past week in particular, it's troubling to me. Yes, well, it's also this idea that somehow, we're going to give you this boost of media literacy, in a vaccine kind of thing, and you're going to be free and clear. And that's not the case. This is a continuous process. It's work. It's understanding and re-understanding and evaluating and re-evaluating and looking at things from multiple perspectives. And it's not something that happens once. It happens throughout. Yeah.
Belinha, thank you so much for your insights and for taking the time with us.
No problem. Thank you.